The Bridging of Two Centuries, the Clinton and Bush Presidencies.
The Clinton presidency. Oh, yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Americans' changing population. Demographic shifts. The United States population reached 306 million people by the 2010 census and surpassed 331 million by 2020 census, with 80% living in urban and suburban areas. Most of the growth in the population occurred in areas that had a mild climate and low taxes. Women continued to enter the workforce and the traditional family unit continued to decline. For African Americans, many moved in from the Rust Belt states in the northern Midwest to southern states, bringing the percentage of African Americans living in the former Confederate states up to 57%. The demographic shifts of the early 21st century brought both optimism and a rise in nativism, much like the past ways immigration had historically. The new immigrants. Immigration and birth rates among American populations impacted the nation's racial and ethnic demography as well. Whereas in 1980 the U.S. population was 80% white, in 2019 the population identified as 60% white, 19% Latino, 13% African American, 5% Asian, and 1% Native American. In addition, nearly 10 million Americans, over 3% of the population, described themselves as multiracial. During the 1990s, the foreign-born population grew to 31 million, averaging 100,000 new immigrants a year. In the early 2000s, the United States received more than twice as many immigrants as the rest of the world's nations combined, primarily from Asia, Latin America, and Africa. More than 46 million foreign-born residents, including 11 million undocumented immigrants, also known as illegal aliens, made the United States their home by 2019, the largest number in American history. Clinton's first term.
Clinton combined charisma, intelligence, and charm with the consummate skill of a politician who used focus groups and public opinion surveys to gauge public opinions and to shape his stance on issues. He tried to fulfill his promise to the gay, lesbian, bisexual community by allowing them to openly serve in the armed forces, but compromised with "don't ask, don't tell" policy after receiving strong opposition from military commanders.
He also realized that he could not deliver on his campaign promise to reduce the federal deficit if he also pursued his cultural middle-class tax cut. To bolster the economy, Clinton signed legislation raising taxes on corporations and individuals in the highest tax brackets. In addition, the North American Free Trade Agreement was ratified, which opened free trade between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Clinton also tried to reform health care by supporting legislation providing all Americans with health care through the federal government, as promised during the campaign. Once in office, Clinton named his wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton, to the position and presented his health care reform bill to Congress in September 1993. However, the Republican attacks on the plan for promoting big government would seal its doom in the end. Congress never had voted on the bill and would go down in defeat in the summer of 1994. Clinton, Congress, and the Supreme Court. In the midterm elections of 1994, the Democrats lost control of the Congress for the first time since the 1980s. The New Republicans were led by Newt Gingrich, who campaigned for office on the Contract with America, a 10-point outline promising the voters what the Republicans would accomplish once in office. A balanced budget amendment, welfare reform, tax cut, term limits were some of the points. Republicans would win both the House and the Senate, first time since 1954. Newt Gingrich would become the Speaker of the House on January 4th of the 104th Congress. For the first time since 1849, three Southerners had controlled the highest level of office. In 1849, it was Zachary Taylor as president, Howell Cobb of Georgia, and David Atchison of Missouri. Now, it was Bill Clinton, President of the United States, Newt Gingrich, Speaker of the House, and Strom Thurmond, who ran for president way back in 1948 as the president pro tempore. Clinton and the Republican-controlled Congress could not agree on the federal budget. In response, Gingrich tried twice, unsuccessfully, to use the federal government shutdown during the fall of 1995 to convince Clinton to agree to Republican demands for a balanced budget. The federal government shut down in January of 1996, as it had the previous November, due to the budget impasse between Clinton and Congress. Public opinion turned against Gingrich and blamed the Republicans. The 104th Congress failed to pass significant legislation, which was seen as a negative do-nothing Congress, and thereby helped Clinton's popularity rise again. The federal courts and race. The Supreme Court ruled against several affirmative action programs in cases such as Adirondack Construction v. Pena in 1995. The Supreme Court held that racial classification imposed by the federal government must be analyzed under a standard of strict scrutiny, and that race is not a sufficient condition for a presumption of a disadvantage. In Hopwood v. Texas in 1996, Texas was the case that was ruled upon the U.S. Court of Appeals, not the Supreme Court, for the Fifth Circuit in 1996. The appeals court held that the University of Texas School of Law could not use race as a factor in determining which applicants to admit to the university. Opponents of affirmative action in California convinced voters to pass Proposition 209, the California Civil Rights Initiative, which ruled out preferential treatment in government hiring, government contracting, and public schools and colleges based on race, sex, ethnicity, or national origin. Ruth Bader Ginsburg became the second woman to become Justice of the Supreme Court with her nomination in 1993 and started what was known as the Ginsburg Rule. When she was asked a question by Republicans, she said, "I could not really answer that until I would see the case in full." Welfare reform. In 1996, Congress enacted legislation ending the open guarantee of welfare on all who asked and limited the amount of time a person could remain in the program. Clinton agreed to this legislation as part of his efforts to depict himself as a centrist who could work with members of both parties. Clinton and the Republicans cooperated to reform the welfare system in 1996. A Republican proposed bill limited how long people could receive benefits. The bill also ended the 60-year-old federal guarantee of welfare instead of gave states block grants. Clinton backed the bill, and some Democrats joined Republicans to pass it. Over the next few years, states moved millions of people from welfare into the jobs. With a stronger economy, the transition was smoother than some liberals had feared. Trade in the global economy. NAFTA took effect on January 1st as agreed by Bush in 1992 and Clinton in 1993. Opponents had claimed that it would shift American jobs to Mexico. The Senate ratified the treaty in 1993. An example of NSC advisor Anthony Lake's enlargement of the free markets, the Uruguay round of GATT, created the New World Trade Organization seen by Clinton as promoting a
vision of economic renewal and part of his gospel of geoeconomics.
But Clinton's new economy of the 90s was a two-tiered economy. International corporations and high-tech innovation produced gross national product growth after the Bush recession. Bill Gates and the top 40% became richer, but the income of the bottom 60% declined. The poorest 20% income declined 15%. Ross Perot became a political leader of the Populist Reform Party because he charted the great second sound of jobs lost to the low-cost foreign workers. Globalization caused a growing trade deficit as Americans imported more than they exported, and the gap between rich and poor grew larger. Under the World Trade Organization, demonstrators would protest the WTO's meeting in Seattle in 1999. They claimed that the WTO's policies hurt poor countries, the environment, and U.S. jobs. This turned violent, and the protesters were members of socialist and communist organizations. Clinton's second term. In the 1996 election, the Democrats renominated Clinton, and the Republicans nominated Senator Bob Dole. Clinton won the election with 49% of the popular vote, becoming the first president to win election twice as a minority candidate, never achieving over 50%, while Dole won 41% and Perot, running again, received 8%. Spurred by technological advances, the stock market soared in the late 1990s, and the federal government had a surplus of revenue in the period 1998 to 2000. The Federal Reserve Board Chairman, Alan Greenspan, predicted that the American economy would continue to grow. But in 2000, many of the new technological startups known as dot-coms failed, and a recession replaced the era of unprecedented growth. Another major development at this time was the ability to transcend historic communication boundaries to welcome in an era of true globalization. Crime and terrorism. In 1993, a bomb exploded in the World Trade Center. Although not many people were hurt or killed and would not have the impact as we'll see in 2001, it still sent nervousness across the country as this was found out to be done by a blind sheiks terrorist group living in the United States. In 1995, the federal office building in Oklahoma City left 168 dead. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols were found guilty. The FBI finally arrested Ted Kaczynski on April 4, 1996 for 16 attacks over the previous 17 years against universities and the technological elite. Kaczynski pleaded guilty in 1998 to his bombing spree that began in 1979 and killed 3 people and injured 23. He was known as the Unabomber. He lived alone in a remote cabin in Montana and led authorities on a nation's longest and costliest manhunt. In Columbine, Colorado, on April 20, 1999, 2 students in a suburban Colorado high school killed 10 students and a teacher and themselves. Critics were split between tougher gun laws and a culture of violence. Foreign policy in the 90s. President Clinton presided as Israel Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin left and PLO leader Yasser Arafat agreed to a peace accord between Israel and the Palestinians in September 1993. Clinton was more interested in domestic politics than global affairs and lacked his predecessor's background in international relations. A secret treaty between the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and Israel in 1993 provided for the restoration of Palestine self-rule on the Gaza Strip and Jericho. The assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin by Israelis who resented his willingness to negotiate with the PLO, however, rocked the nation and increased tensions in the region. He was replaced 7 months later by Benjamin Netanyahu, a conservative nationalist Israeli who seemed unlikely to negotiate with the Palestinians. The Wye River Accords reached by PLO leader Arafat, Netanyahu, and Jordan's King Hussein in discussions led by Clinton traded Israel-held land for PLO security guarantees. The Balkans. In 1991, Yugoslavia, a nation that had basic communist tendencies, imploded, and the former nation of multiple ethnicities began to wage a civil war. In 1991, Slovenia and Croatia seceded from the Federation, followed by the republics of Macedonia in September 1991 and Bosnia and Herzegovina in March of 1991. Slobodan Milosevic was elected president of Serbia in December 1991. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization troops were dispatched to keep the peace in the region in October 1995. And then in February 1998, the predominantly Serbian forces under Yugoslavian President Slobodan Milosevic launched an attack against Kosovo, a province on the border inhabited primarily by Muslims who were ethnic Albanians. Milosevic's brutal program was one of ethnic cleansing, a term used to describe the systematic removal of the ethnic group from a territory through violence or intimidation in an effort to create homogeneity. At least 2,000 people had been killed and more than 400,000 were driven from their homes. The Orthodox Christian Serbs battled the Kosovo Liberation Army, which fought to secure its independence. In 1999, the United States sponsored NATO strikes on Serbia to save the Kosovar people. Finally, the Serbs would withdraw. Milosevic's rejection of claims of a first-round opposition victory in new elections for the federal presidency in September 2000 led to mass demonstrations in Belgrade, and on October 5th, and the collapse of the regime's authority. Later, he would be arrested and sent to The Hague, where he is tried for war crimes. Milosevic conducted his own defense in a 5-year trial, which ended without a verdict, where he died in a prison cell in The Hague on March 11, 2006. China. Clinton wanted China to progress and become more democratic. Congress would agree and pass a bill in 2000 giving China favored nation status. The impact of this would be huge. With no trade barriers or very little trade barriers, American companies would have their products, as you see there, Nike, produced overseas on pennies on the dollar and then shipped to the United States. China would start becoming an industrial power due to this favored nation status. Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda means the base, and it comes from when groups of Muslim extremists saw the stationing of U.S. troops in the Middle East after the Gulf War as another violation of their lands. They preached jihad, which they defined as a holy war against the Jews and the Crusaders. The goal of Al-Qaeda and others was to restore an Islamic caliphate or realm. Their leader was billionaire Osama bin Laden. In 1998, the bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania killed over 200 people, including 12 Americans. The United States responded by bombing al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan and the Sudan. Al-Qaeda leader bin Laden then fled to Afghanistan and allied himself with the Taliban, an Islamic fundamentalist who controlled Afghanistan. In the year 2000, 2 suicide bombers and a small rubber boat nearly sank a billion-dollar warship, the USS Cole, docked in the Middle Eastern country of Yemen. The scandal machine. During his first term in office, Clinton had been dogged by allegations of improper involvement in an Arkansas land deal while governor, the Whitewater Development Company, to fund his 1984 gubernatorial re-election campaign. Once the Republicans took control of Congress in 1994, they appointed Kenneth Starr to serve as an independent counsel for this case. Ultimately, his investigation turned over an improper relationship between the president and a young intern, Monica Lewinsky, then friend and confidant of Linda Tripp, was, unbeknownst to Lewinsky, recording their telephone conversation regarding her affair with Clinton. Later, Tripp would serve the tapes to Ken Starr, the independent prosecutor, and would be the basis for a continued investigation. Under immunity, Lewinsky admitted to having an improper relationship with the president. Originally, Clinton denied the charges, saying,
"I did not have sexual relationship with that woman, Miss Lewinsky."
But by August 1998, President Bill Clinton becomes the first sitting president to testify before a grand jury investigating his conduct, where, while the questioning of the White House was finished, and it was very obvious that he had lied to the grand jury investigation. Clinton would go on national TV to admit that he had an inappropriate relationship with Monica Lewinsky. Starr's report resulted in impeachment charges of high crimes and misdemeanors for lying to the grand jury being passed against Clinton by the House of Representatives on December 19, 1998. Perjury and obstruction of justice were the 2 charges, only the second time a president had been impeached. The Senate acquitted Clinton mostly along party lines. A few Democrats joined Republicans in a 55-45 vote, so he was not removed from office. However, Clinton did lose his law license. President Clinton was able to revitalize the Democratic Party during his administration and was well regarded for his charisma and charm. At the same time, he had a reckless and arrogance that hindered his legacy and caused his legislative agenda more harm than good. The election of 2000. The Democrats would choose Vice President Al Gore to succeed Bill Clinton. Despite the Lewinsky affair, Clinton's popularity was still pretty high. Gore would select Senator Joe Lieberman as his running mate. Senator Lieberman would be the first Jew to be on a major ticket. The Republicans would nominate Texas Governor George W. Bush and Dick Cheney as vice president. The election night confusion. Al Gore appeared to be in the lead early on in Florida, and then the networks would declare that it was too close to call. But by 2 o'clock in the morning, the networks predicted Florida would go to Bush. On his way to make his concession speech, Gore was informed by his campaign chair not to concede, that the voting count was still too close to call. Florida seemed to be the very pivotal state. Whoever would win Florida would win the presidency. In a recount of the vote, Bush maintained a 300-vote lead. The Democrats would file that there would have to be a manual recount. But as you see in this picture here, the guy looking at with the spyglass, In some of the counties in which there were problems, Broward, Miami-Dade, Volusia, and Palm Beach counties, with the exception of Volusia, where Democrats demanded a recount, the butterfly ballot, of course, is what was punctured with just a little device. Some of those punctures did not go through, and so came the debate on whether you could count what they called a pregnated chad, in which was just a bubble, or a hanging chad that was hanging by a thread. This, of course, caused a lot of controversy and problems on both sides, as was it the intention for the voter to vote or not, which was also problematic in Palm Beach, the butterfly ballot. People who thought they were voting for Gore actually voted for a third-party candidate, Pat Buchanan. The Supreme Court decision. The court first ruled 7-2 strictly on equal protection grounds that the recount be stopped, citing the use of different standards of counting the different counties. This was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Then the court ruled 5-4 against the remedy of sending the case back to Florida to complete the recount, using a uniform statewide standard before the scheduled December 18th meeting of Florida electors. The court stating that the safe harbor deadline would therefore violate the Florida Election Code, rejecting an extension on the deadline, giving the electoral vote to Florida to George Bush. Gore would finally concede to Bush to become the president of the United States.
The purpose of the Electoral College was to protect the minority states. That's why the Founding Fathers did not want to have the popular vote. And for an example, as we see this in action, is the 2000 election between Democrat Vice President Al Gore and Governor George W. Bush of Texas. Now, on election night, Florida was still up in question, and it was a very close race. It would take until a Supreme Court case of Bush v. Gore, in which the United States Supreme Court ruled that Florida was in violation of the 14th Amendment because they were not counting the votes equally. And since the deadline for the electors to meet by December 19th was very close, it was decided to just go ahead and not to try to extend it any further, and Gore ceded to Bush. So when you read in your textbook and everything else, it looks like that's what won George Bush's election, but not necessarily. It was really the state of West Virginia. 5 electoral votes, as you see, is very small. However, West Virginia, in the last 100 years, previously only voted for the Republican in the 1956 election for Eisenhower, in the 1984 election for Ronald Reagan. So only twice did they ever go Republican. This time they did. If they still had voted Democrat, like they did the majority of the time, Florida would not have mattered, not even with their electoral votes.
The presidency of George W. Bush. Domestic policy. The tax cuts. In 2001, Congress, enjoying a rare budget surplus, passed a $1.35 trillion tax cut spread over 10 years. The bill lowered the top bracket and gradually eliminated estate taxes, increased the child tax credit and limits for IRA and 401k contributions, and gave all taxpayers an immediate tax rebate. The No Child Left Behind Act aimed to improve student performance and close the gap between well-to-do poor students in the public schools through testing of all students nationwide, granting students the right to transfer to better schools, funding stronger reading programs, and training high-quality teachers. Republicans also passed laws to give seniors enrolled in Medicare the option to enroll in private insurance companies. Congress also fulfilled a campaign promise by Bush to provide prescription drug coverage for seniors. Democrats criticized the legislation as primarily designed to profit insurance and drug companies. September 11, 2001. Similar to December 7th, 1941, the date which would live in infamy, many Americans will never forget this day. At 8:45 a.m., a hijacked passenger jet, American Airlines Flight 11, would crash into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, tearing a gaping hole in the building and then setting it on fire. At 9:03 a.m., a second hijacked airliner, United Flight 175, would crash into the South Tower of the World Trade Center and explode. Americans were captivated, watching on their television as they seen this terrorist attack unfold on their home ground. But it wasn't over yet. At 9:43 a.m., the American Airlines Flight 77 would crash into the Pentagon. And Hero Flight 93, which the hijackers hijacked, would later be determined that their target was either going to be the White House or the Capitol building. Passengers would take over the airline and it would crash in a Pennsylvania field. The attacks had galvanized the public opinion as nothing had since the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and they empowered the Bush administration to take action. Bush originally was in Florida when he heard the reports and was flying around the nation to various safe ports before Vice President Dick Cheney told him it would be safe to come back to Washington, D.C. That night, Bush would address the nation and say, "Thousands of lives are suddenly ended by evil, and these acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. The U.S. government will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed the acts and those who harbored them." President Bush would address a joint session in Congress to ask them to declare a war on terror. And the first target is going to be the U.S. troops to attack the Taliban in Afghanistan, who refused to hand over Osama bin Laden, who was responsible for the 9/11 attacks. From 9/11 would be the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. It was combining 20 federal agencies, including for intelligence, FBI, CIA, and the National Security Administration, when it was determined in a congressional committee hearings that none of them spoke to one another, and if they had contacted one another, that 9/11 could probably have been prevented. The Secret Service and Coast Guard were also included in the Department of Homeland Security. This would become the largest reorganization of the department since the Department of Defense since 1947.
Afghanistan. Invoking Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, an attack on one is an attack on all. NATO allies would join the United States and other international support to launch an attack on the Afghan Taliban regime on October 7, 2001. They were responsible for harboring bin Laden and al-Qaeda and refused to give them up. The war would end on December 8, 2001, as the Afghan Taliban regime would falter and fail. However, this would not end the entire war of Afghanistan, as the United States would remain for several decades before they would finally be withdrawn in 2021. Iraq. In 2002, Bush launched a new policy of preemptive attacks against nations that were viewed as being hostile to the United States and preparing to attack them. He cited concerns of terrorist networks coupled with unstable nations with weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and asserted that the United States would extend the benefits of freedom across the globe for all peoples everywhere. In 2002, Bush urged the United Nations to confront Iraq about Saddam Hussein's actions toward the United States. The UN passed a resolution demanding Iraq disarm or face serious consequences. But when Hussein did not, on March 19, Bush ordered in the U.S. troops along with British forces. Within 6 weeks, the Iraqi war was over, and Saddam Hussein would later be captured by the new Iraqi government, tried, and executed. Bush later admitted that his primary justification for the war, WMDs, had not been found in Iraq. Once the war was over, the United States set on rebuilding the nation. It was soon apparent that the administration had misjudged the difficulty of unifying and pacifying the region. Iraqi insurgent groups attacked the coalition forces, while Bush urged Americans to continue to support the efforts. The war costs continued to escalate, adding to the already growing national deficit. The election of 2004. Republicans would nominate George W. Bush and Dick Cheney again for president and vice president. Democrats would nominate Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts and Senator John Edwards of North Carolina. For the campaign, foreign policy was the dominant theme throughout the election campaign, particularly Bush's handling of the war on terror and the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Bush presented himself as a decisive leader and attacked Kerry as a flip-flopper, while Kerry criticized Bush's conduct of the Iraq War. Domestic issues were debated as well, including the economy and jobs, healthcare, same-sex marriages, and embryonic stem research. Bush won by a narrow margin of 35 electoral votes and took 50.7% of the popular vote. In addition, Republicans increased the majorities in both houses of Congress in the concurrent congressional elections, which gave Bush a comfortable congressional majority as he entered his second term. Second term blues. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast, virtually destroying New Orleans and heavily damaging Alabama and Mississippi. Katrina left 1,500 dead, destroyed 160,000 homes, and left hundreds of thousands homeless, causing over $1 billion in damage. Nearly 500,000 citizens in New Orleans were evacuated, and many of those who remained were videotaped looting and pillaging the closed city. Both local and federal officials were caught off guard in this emergency. Mayor Nagin of New Orleans was criticized for alleging failing to execute the New Orleans disaster plan, which called for the use of the city's school buses in evacuating residents unable to leave on their own. The city never deployed the buses, which were subsequently destroyed in the flooding and ultimately could not get people to evacuate. Governor Blanco of Louisiana received criticism for failure to effectively use state National Guard troops under the command to quell civil unrest in the advance of humanitarian relief efforts, yet they failed to do so in the first few days of the hurricanes. President Bush ultimately took failure for the failure of the FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security to respond. It didn't help matters that it took 4 days after Hurricane Katrina hit before he even made a statement. The 2006 midterms. In 2006 midterm elections, the Democrats capitalized on the poor public approval ratings of Bush and won control of both the House and the Senate, mostly due to what happened in Hurricane Katrina and the ongoing war in Iraq. They also won several governorships in the House. History was made when Nancy Pelosi from California became the first female Speaker of the House of Representatives. Surge and bust. In an attempt to revitalize the war effort in Iraq, Bush approved of a plan to bolster troops in the area. The policy was successful as violence in that nation declined dramatically thanks to the added soldiers. Following the 2001 recession, the U.S. economy again skyrocketed. Home values rose to new levels, and consumer spending, much of it on credit, spurred industrial growth. However, all that came to an end when the bottom fell out of the market in 2008, which was also a presidential election year. What happened as a decline in home prices ended up in a global economic crisis. Investment accounts were crippled while banks foreclosed on homes and were foreclosed on themselves. Congress would pass the Troubled Asset Relief Program, known as TARP, which gave banks upward to $700 billion to stay afloat.